Hi guys, so it's very clear that the subject of dual wielding is a popular topic, and as we have covered in previous videos, yes, dual wielding was done historically all over the world, different places, different times. It was done in India, in Europe, in parts of the Far East, parts of South America, all over. So you can find examples of dual wielding from all over the world from different periods of time. However, we've also discussed that it's a very context-based thing. It was done pretty much only in, relatively limited periods of time, limited places. It wasn't a massively widespread thing found all over the world throughout history, and that's, there are many reasons for that. So I thought I would just discuss some potential disadvantages of so-called dual wielding, that is, in this case, using two swords at the same time. Well, very clearly, a number one kind of obvious disadvantage of dual wielding is that both your hands are occupied. Okay, I now can't do anything with one of my hands. If I'm a normal person and I use just one weapon here, then now this left hand is free to do things. Now why might I want a left hand to be free to do things? Well, one very clear example, which is very applicable to much of history, is riding a horse. Yes, there are in fact some tangential examples of people using two weapons on the back of a horse, or indeed using a two-handed weapon on the back of a horse. However, generally speaking, most people require their left hand to hold the reins of the horse, and then use their either lance or sword or whatever they've got in their right hand. And of course a shield can be strapped onto the forearm, so you can still use a shield and hold reins to a horse, and you've got your weapon free. Okay, so clearly riding is a good example why you might want a left hand free. Another good example why you might want a left hand free is just general things that you want to do. Imagine you're fighting in an urban environment and you need to open a door. If I'm holding two swords, what do I put my weapon down and then open the door and check there's no one inside? It's just a big hassle. Do I then sheath the weapon, put the sword back in its scabbard while I do my thing? If I want to have a drink, if I want to pick up something that's pick up some loot or do whatever. So just having both hands occupied by a weapon can be a disadvantage in itself, although of course you could say the same of holding a buckler or a dagger or other weapons that you commonly hold in your left hand. But there is another disadvantage to using two swords, and this is something that I haven't seen anyone else pick up on yet, and that is when you're using one weapon, generally speaking at any one time you have one side of your body forward and the other side of the body back. Now this does a couple of very important things biomechanically. Number one, of course, it means that my shoulder is now forwards. If I'm using a one-handed sword, for example, one shoulder is forward. Incidentally, if it was a long sword, generally you either have one shoulder forward or the other shoulder forward, depending on which side you're attacking from. The general rule with two-handed weapons, and the same goes for staff or pole axe or two-handed axe or indeed long swords, the general rule is if you're striking from the right hand side, at the moment of impact you have the right shoulder forward. If you're striking from the left hand side, at the moment of impact you have the left shoulder forward. That's simply because of the way that you're connected to the weapon. That's what biomechanically makes sense. But in addition to the biomechanics of striking, and the same of course is true with a one-handed weapon, it's attached to your dominant arm, so your dominant arm tends to be forwards most of the time. Even if you use passing footwork, at the moment of striking you tend to have one shoulder forward or the other one forward. One of the advantages of this is that your body is a smaller target, and you're always turning, and of course your body is attached to your hips and your legs. It means that one foot's in front of the other. Now, when you've got two weapons, it means that, generally speaking, one shoulder or the other is going to be forwards, but you spend, perhaps, debatably, more of the time with your body a little bit more square on to the opponent. Okay, it means you're constantly sort of fighting from a position where you're a bit more square on. Okay, unless you prioritise how you use these two weapons, and indeed, the few times that I dual wield, that I use two swords when I'm messing about, just having a bit of fun, or doing melee sparring like you've seen in a recent video, I tend to actually not use them like they're two swords. What I'm really doing is I'm using one sword as a thing to defend with, and I'm actually really using it as a shield. Okay, so I know that I can parry fairly effectively with my left hand, and I use this for parrying while striking with my right hand. Okay, so it's actually quite similar to using rapier and dagger or sword and buckler. I'm just using this like I would use a buckler or a dagger to defend with. Now, the other thing you can do incidentally in melee games is actually use this weapon just simply holding it out to essentially occupy one person over here whilst actually striking someone over there. And it doesn't really matter what this object is. It doesn't need to be a sword. You could do the same thing with a stick or with a spear, or perhaps debatably with an axe, although once you start to get to shorter weapons, bucklers and daggers and shorter axes, you can't really occupy someone so well over here as you can do with a longer weapon that has a pointy end. So really spears and swords are a bit better at this. And you know, it's a useful thing, especially when you're fighting potentially multiple opponents, just being able to keep one person occupied there whilst dealing with someone else over here with your other weapon. But like I say, it's something that you could do with all sorts of objects. It doesn't need to be a sword. So disadvantages of using two swords are that your hand is occupied. That means you can't do things with that hand. But more importantly than that, and this is a really important point that I try and mention as often as I can in any of these kind of videos on this topic, is that a shield is far superior to using two swords. Okay? Yes, some people would argue two swords, well, this one can offend and this one can offend, so essentially I've got two offensive objects. Well, a shield can offend as well. You can strike with a shield. But more importantly than that, on a battlefield or in a skirmish or any battle situation where someone could throw something or shoot something at you, this is not really, unless you're incredibly unnaturally skilled, this is not really able to defend from things like arrows or thrown spears or a rock or these kind of things. Okay, whereas a shield absolutely can. First of all, the shield has a passive defense. The very fact that you've got a large object protecting one side of your body means that just accidentally, some of the time, it will protect you. Okay, it covers one side of your body. But even if you see something incoming, I don't know how many of you out there have stood at the target end of an archery range, but actually arrows don't move very fast. Okay, they only move, I'm actually not sure, I think it's about 150 miles an hour, which actually when you're on the receiving end, you can see it incoming and very simply step aside. It's one of my biggest objections to these displays where people bat or cut arrows out of the air with a sword, because why would you need to do that? Because frankly, if you see the arrow coming towards you, which you need to be able to do to cut it, if you see the arrow coming towards you, you just step out of the way. You don't have to hit it with your sword. And the other thing is, when you hit an arrow with a sword, the bits of the arrow split and go in usually two directions, and that makes it unpredictable, and you might get hit by it, or your friend next to you might get hit by it, whereas if you just step out of the way, you know you're not going to get hit by it. Anyway, that's a tangent. The point is, the shield, if you see an arrow incoming or a spear which travels even slower, you can just put the shield in the way relatively easily. The only bit you can't protect really are your legs, and again, if you see the thing incoming, you just step out of the way with your legs. Okay, so the shield has a passive defense against things you can't see incoming that covers a large part of your body, but also the shield of course has an active defense that you can actually block things and strike at the same time and this kind of thing. So by and large, two swords have some advantages over perhaps not using anything in your left hand at all. However, having a spare left hand does have some advantages. Another thing which I didn't mention earlier was armoured fighting. These swords that I'm holding here, two tulwars, are not able to do anything really effectively against someone wearing full plate armour. If my opponent's wearing full plate armour, my best option is to drop one of these weapons, okay, and essentially grapple with them, either wrestling into really close grappling range and try and get them on the floor if possible, and then try and get this point into somewhere that a plate isn't, or indeed to half sword, or things like this. So armoured fighting using two swords, I know they do it in the SCA and reenactment stuff, but remember, in SCA and reenactment all they're doing is bashing the armour. They're not trying to actually really hurt each other. If you're trying to hurt someone wearing full plate armour, you need to get the point into a gap in the armour. Okay, it's not bashing them for minutes or hours on end is not going to do you any good. Okay, so there are some occasions when it's much better to drop that second weapon, and in fact, as I mentioned, you also have a longer reach and you present only one side of your body when you use a weapon only in one hand. So there are certainly situations where I would choose absolutely to only use one sword and present one side forward and have a longer reach than having two weapons necessarily. And finally, the most important point, if you can have a large shield owns two swords, okay? Not only against it in a one-on-one situation where a large shield is generally better, but also in a battle situation, a shield is so much better than a second sword, because the second sword can't really protect you from missile weapons, and missile weapons are one of the major reasons why you might end up dead, and a shield will protect you when a second sword won't. So there we go, a few more thoughts on the subject of dual wielding. Cheers guys!